And I believe that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the human perception of scarcity is necessarily contextual and comparative. You may not have guessed this, but I'm a science fiction fan. Love reading science fiction. There's a great novelist, Peter F. Hamilton. He details a future 700 years hence where human beings have experienced this exponential growth in science and technology. One of the technologies and foremost in the society he envisages is rejuvenation, where a human being goes in for genetic rejuvenation, their physical body is brought back to their age as an 18-year-old. They grow old again, they have it done again. An amazing imaginative advance in technology. The haves and have-nots in that society become measured by who can afford the technology and how long you have to wait between rejuvenations. How old do you become before you get to go back in and have a new physical body? And I guess the point is that, yes, medical technologies that emerge are very expensive. They become cheaper as they become older, if you like. But of course, then a new medical technology develops and we want access to it. And so human scarcity is always measured, or scarcity is always measured in a comparative sense. The second thing I'd say is that there are known and observable consequences of scientific and technological advance that themselves create scarcity. So the first, obviously, and this relates to the idea of the weightless economy, is that the fact of science and technological advancement has allowed us to have a planet with a massive population. And that population wants energy and consumer durables that the energy will run. And that in itself places greater pressure on resources. Inside Western democratic nations, science and medical technology has increased longevity. Longevity brings with it Alzheimer's. It brings with it a whole range of strains that are placed on our economic system. So development itself creates its own scarcity. I'd make the obvious point, thirdly, that scientific advancement is not always net welfare positive. Knowledge is a mixed good, and there's a tendency to believe that it's not. I mean, the same technology that brings us antibiotics brings us cheaply produced crystal methamphetamine and all the problems that come with it. The fourth thing I'd say is that there are often unintended consequences of scientific development. I won't explain to you what they are because they're unknown and unintended. But let me put to you this. Here's a quote from a scientific study of an animal. This animal had become a major urban planning nightmare. It had strained governments to the breaking point, vexed the media, tormented the citizenry, brought society to the brink of despair. This animal was seen as the greatest ecological disaster of its time, and the motor vehicle was said to be the cure to this ecological disaster. That was, of course, the horse. And people believed truly, although it's hard to understand now, that the motor vehicle would be an ecological saviour to horse manure and all of the problems that were created by horse manure in open roads and sewers not 150 years ago. So there are many unintended consequences of science. Now, they are not the least of the problems, I think, in terms of observing liberal democratic utopianism, because the fact is this, is that the spectacular failure of Marxism to usher in a new utopian way of living for humankind has not shaken our faith as liberal democrats in the idea that you can combine science and technology with some form of political action and unlock the key to continual human prosperity across the board. And this brings me to three other forms of the liberal mindset at the moment that I perceive are morphing together and producing a very dangerous approach in public policy. So I've spoken about science in a ceteris paribus way. What if it wasn't combined with anything else? But what is clear about modern liberal democrats is many of them believe that there is some magic, some organisational magic out there that can combine with what we've seen as this massive exponential growth in science and technology and produce some kind of utopian result. And that begs the question for a democratic liberal, what type of political action is now required? And there are two types, I think, that liberal democrats envisage. The first is an idea about continual political progress. This idea is that I think some modern liberals possess a belief in the ability of political action to combine with advancements in knowledge as a means of bringing about an ideal world, and the political action they perceive that will bring about this ideal world will come. It will simply happen, that we are progressing towards it. There's a vagueness to this, obviously. No one can identify what it is, but somehow it's just a lack of political understanding about how we should fine-tune and regulate our human institutions that is preventing us unlocking scientific miracles. And I see this very much in the rhetoric of Barack Obama. Now, let me put this to you, because it seems remarkable to me that in the period of the greatest increase of knowledge in the world's history, that the great majority of younger people may actually be becoming less knowledgeable. And this is a theory that goes back to Harold Bloom and before him when he wrote The Closing of the American Mind. I mean, if so much of the information economy is devoted towards entertainment, are people actually any smarter now in the information age? It often strikes me when I watch a documentary where letters are written by soldiers, apparently non-tertiary educated soldiers in World War I or World War II, the eloquence with which they put a statement or a view or a belief, it's absent now. It's absent to me when I have seen it, and I've lectured at university, even amongst some of the better students there. The point is this, is that if radical advances in knowledge aren't commensurately bringing about radical advancements in the amelioration of the human condition, what's gone wrong? And Liberal Democrats of the utopian type think something about our organisation has gone wrong. There must be something that we are missing, something that's holding us back. And there is an evolutionary view which starts to look like Marxist historical determinism inside the idea that whatever it is that's holding us back inside our political institutions, we will find it, because we are inexorably moving towards that perfect structure. Now, this to me has occurred for two reasons. One is that there are two strands in liberal democratic thought which are very pervasive and that have grown and morphed together. That is universalism of the type that we've seen with Francis Fukuyama, and also what I'll call meliorism, which is a modest liberal view that things would get better. And not just material prosperity, but also human institutions would walk hand in hand and they would get better. But that was modest, and it was sceptical of an idea that you'd be able to achieve perfection of human institutions or perfection of the human condition. And what has now come to pass, I believe, is that modern liberals, or many of them, have mistaken what they have seen in the advancement of science, which I concede is exponential and apparently irreversible and linear, and they have believed that the same thing, the same laws, must apply inside Western liberal democratic systems, which is to say we can't tell you exactly what's wrong, but we know that it will be fixed in due course. The second liberal tenet, which I think some liberals apply to the idea of science and technology, what are you going to weld it with to make a utopia? I'll call it systemic legalism, and that is the views of philosophers from Mill through to Rawls that somehow you can come up with a perfect principle, which just hasn't been applied yet. So for Mill, the principle was the greatest equal liberty principle. Many of you would have read Rawls, a slightly more sophisticated attempt at it, but this liberal idea that somehow that revealed to the perfect mind will be the perfect principle, you can put it into place. And what that thinking says is that when you combine that with modern technological advance, you will create perfect conditions. The final point I'd make, because I'm running out of time, is that about human nature. So an over-reliance and over-optimism about science, a faith in political action of the type which is linear and progressional, and we just assume that our human institutions will be perfected, or thirdly, a view that we can come up with a perfect system somehow, although no one's done it yet, but there have been many attempts. Fourthly, there is a strand inside liberalism which has gained a very strong dominance, which is a view of human nature. Now, utopianism of all the types that have existed in the last 200 years cannot be perfectly reduced to an idea or a single idea of human nature. And there are a variety of ideas of human nature that sit inside the liberal tradition. But what I detect is one view of human nature is starting to percolate to the surface in an overly optimistic way. And if you go back to St. Augustine and the idea that we are mortal sinners who can only be perfected by the grace of God, and then look at the way that Pelagius invented a view which was antithetical to that, a notion that we are inherently good and we can perfect ourselves, I would say that there's been two strands of views about human nature that have existed inside liberalism, and it is the latter of those two which is gaining a very strong ascendancy inside modern liberal thought. So in summary for you, that may all sound very pessimistic, but it's not. What it is a proposition that public policy is very difficult, that you improve things in the way that Karl Popper thought that you improve things, slowly. You improve things 5.5% at a time, generally speaking, in government. However, there are many public policy makers who have bought in to the Obamian tendency to believe that you can combine science and technology with something that we don't yet see or understand, but must be there, some or other tweak to our system, which will produce plenty. So much indeed that you can endlessly redistribute and have a perfectly happy society. Unfortunately, working in government, having spent 10 years inside criminal justice, wickedness, poverty, poor individual choices, they are part and parcel of the human condition. And we may hope to ameliorate them into the future, but we will never, ever, at least in the foreseeable future, take them away from human society. So optimism, yes. Boundless optimism that veers into utopianism, I am railing against it. But thank you very much for your attention.